Gleich geht's los. Ja, schönen guten Abend allerseits. Herzlich willkommen zur Ringvorlesung, zur 4. Ringvorlesung dieses Semester. Wie Sie ja wissen, haben wir die Ringvorlesung eingerichtet, um auch mal ein bisschen über den Tellerrand hinauszuschauen und Themen aus der Wissenschaft und Praxis Ihnen näher zu bringen, in der Vorlesung relativ wenig Zeit ist. Wir bieten die Vorlesung auch immer parallel hier im Raum und übers Internet an. Und heute haben wir wieder einen Gast aus Chile oder Spanien. Und ich würde jetzt, da der Vortrag auch auf Englisch ist, noch direkt ins Englische wechseln, Ihnen vorstellen. Wir haben dann Zeit, den Vortrag anzuhören und dann gemeinsam darüber zu diskutieren. Und für diejenigen von Ihnen, die übers Internet zugeschaltet sind, Sie können auch übers Internet Fragen stellen. Okay, so may I introduce you, Carlos? So Carlos Castillo is currently a distinguished professor at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He's working there since roughly 1.5 years. He studied computer engineer from Chile, did his Ph.D. also in Chile, and then was senior scientist in a couple of different areas. One was Yahoo Research Center. From there he moved to the Qatar Institute and was working a lot on crisis data and artificial intelligence, use of crisis data in the context of social media, which is very interesting work, and I think we hear a couple of things about that as well. And his focus is on web mining, data mining, and there are a couple of terms for that: crisis informatics, social computing, and in principle it's an interdisciplinary approach where you look at a variety of different disciplines and how you can leverage social media data for crisis management. So he's also a well-known researcher, and therefore I'm specifically honored to have you here. You are well-known scientists and published more than 80 papers in highly relevant journals, and you also published recently a book on big crisis data, and therefore I'm really looking forward. The book has the same name as the title. It's Big Crisis Data, Velocity, Validity, and Volunteering, and I'm looking forward to your speech, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here. I have prepared a presentation based on some chapters of the Big Crisis Data book. You can find some of these chapters online for free. And particularly today, I'm going to focus on the volume of data. I'm going to focus on the validity of the data, or how can it help us to understand better a disaster, also in combination with authoritative data, not only user-generated data. And also a bit about volunteering and how volunteering and crowdsourcing can also help us here. I think many of you have seen this example. I think it's one of the most dramatic examples of crowdsourcing or volunteering done through the internet. This was in 2010. There was a big earthquake in Haiti. And here, this is a map of the capital, Port-au-Prince, in 2010 on the day of the earthquake. And this is a map taken from OpenStreetMap, which is like you can think of it like a Wikipedia of maps. So it's a volunteer effort to create a map. And then you see on the next day, a big amount of the information that is added to this map. And then 2 weeks later, you have a really detailed map. Of course, just as we can speak of a digital divide, and there are rich countries and poor countries in terms of connectivity, there is also a data divide. And there are data-rich countries and data-poor countries. So if you look at any example of a map, like a map created by volunteers, if you look at a map of Manhattan, of course you will see lots of detail. But if you look at a map of a poorer place, most likely you will see this level of detail. So it's really interesting how many thousands of hours of work can be mobilized through the internet to go from this point to this point. Now, more generally, today disasters are creating a huge amount of information that is contributed by volunteers and by people who are affected by the disaster, but also by people who are not necessarily on the place where a disaster takes place, and the information is very valuable. So, for instance, this happened in early 2016. You may remember some bombings in Brussels, both at the airport and at a metro station, and this is an observation 8 hours later. So 8 hours later, you already have a very detailed article on the Wikipedia specifying coordinates, number of victims, possible perpetrators, and all the information that is known about this, distilled, curated, and really, really well done. Then in 8 hours, more than 700 YouTube videos, many of them duplicates, but many of them unique. Then a Reddit post with 17,000 comments about the Brussels bombing, in which the comment number 1 is really a very detailed account of what happened. And then Facebook activated safety check, but also many Facebook pages were created to deal with this disaster. And on Twitter, you have many tweets and many photos, right? This is a big amount of information. And the first thing we have to say about this information is that as many of what you call user-generated content, or even social media as a particular instance of user-generated content, a lot of it is redundant, and a lot of this is useless, right? A lot of this is just repetitions of things you already know, but nevertheless, you have among these hundreds of videos, these thousands of comments, these thousands of words, you find really valuable information. The thing is that it's somehow is hidden in a big mass of information, right? So this tells you something about the scale. Note here that the x-axis is logarithmic. The bars that are darker, they are crisis or disaster events, right? So the Hurricane Sandy, the Boston Marathon bombings, and an earthquake in Japan in 2011, right? And this scale is measured in hundreds of, in this case, tweets per second, right? And you have a typical scale of in the order of a few hundred to a few thousand tweets per second. So for instance, the Japan earthquake in 2011 or the Boston Marathon bombings, they have between 700 and 1,200 tweets per second. Now, of course, there is no group of volunteers, no human that can deal with this amount of information on her own. You need some technology to be able to filter out these things. And this is only expected to grow. So as there are more people using social media and there are more people on the internet, you can only expect these numbers to become stay the same or become bigger in the future. And you can even have cases like events that are not necessarily disaster events, but maybe on the contrary for Germany, the 2014 World Cup final that have peak rates of 10,000 tweets per second, right? So you're talking about an insane amount of data that of course somebody needs to filter out, because here in these 10,000 messages per second there is very valuable information. The problem is that to arrive to this, you really need to go through a lot of information that is not so valuable. Now, I would say that what characterizes social media response as other user-generated content is variability, right? So there's a lot of variety and how different events impact social media. And in our studies, this variability is mostly related to the type of event, not necessarily to the type of hazard, but to some characteristics of the event. And among these characteristics, I would like to point out 3. One is whether the disaster is natural or let's say human-induced, which is one possible categorization. Whether the disaster has a slow onset or has a sudden onset, like is instantaneous or cannot be anticipated, and whether the disaster covers a small area or a large area. Right? These 3 characteristics, among others, they tend to change the response that you observe in social media. In general, disasters that are the product of natural hazards tend to have a social media footprint that includes much more truthful information, much more trustworthy information than human-induced disasters that tend to include disinformation, right? I will come back to this topic later in the talk, but this is a scenario where social media can be trusted less. Then you have the fact that a disaster is focalized or diffuse affects the amount of potential witnesses of a situation. The more witnesses you have, the more likely that you will have redundant information, and redundancy is good, Redundancy from social media allows you to have different perspectives on the same topic, allows you to cross-reference, verify information. So the larger the area that a disaster covers, the more useful will be the information that you can obtain from social media. And regarding progressive versus instantaneous disaster, this has more to do with how useful the information is. So especially in a disaster that cannot be anticipated, such as an attack or an earthquake, where you have something very big happening, but you could not have anticipated it before, during the first minutes, the first hours of this disaster, nothing is better than social media to provide you information with respect to what just happened, right? So you may, in some cases, you may not have any alternative source of information, particularly when the event was instantaneous and affecting a large area. To me, the prototypical case of these are earthquakes, right? So in the case of earthquake, you may experience that you have a large number of reports coming from different places about different things, and the police cannot be everywhere, the disaster management people cannot be everywhere, the ambulances cannot be everywhere. The only people who are everywhere are people, right, and people who use, in this case, social media. Now, in our past work, the typical and current work, the typical users are one of these three people, right? So emergency responders, but also humanitarian or disaster management organizations, and a big category that we would call the public, right? So journalists and the public, including people who are affected by a disaster or people who have some relationship to what has happened, right? And as many other software projects, if you think of this in terms of software, you will find that people don't know what they want. We never know what we want. People don't know what they want. And these requirements also change over time, right? So you, in my case, as a provider of technology, so someone who develops or research on technology, then I find myself dealing with requirements that are not really specified and that change over time, right? Now, these requirements or the kind of questions that you can ask from the disaster response and disaster management and risk management communities to social media typically fall into one of these two categories. They are either people who want to know what are the general parameters of a disaster, particularly how many people were affected, how many people were injured, how much is going to be the cost of this disaster. This is what you can call like big picture kind of questions. So these are people who really are not going to respond to individual cases. They just want to know how many resources need to be mobilized, right? An insurer will also ask about these big picture questions. And humanitarian relief agencies ask big picture questions, right? But then you have, if you go to the more local level, you will find emergency management, the police, asking you questions about what is actionable, right? What are these sub-events, this information that you will have to respond to, right? These are the actionable insights or actionable things, right? These are particular events or particular needs of the population that are expressed to social media. Now, much more research has been done here regarding actionable data points than regarding the big picture, and I will explain why in a moment, right? But the first area, like how to capture general disaster parameters, is much less explored. Most of what, so for a person who works in computing, social media is not an easy data object to deal with, right? So the traditional computational methods are designed and developed to deal with structured data, particularly relational data, meaning tables, right? So tables of information, these are very easy for computing people to process. Graphs, not so much. Text is one of the most challenging data types to work with, right? And indeed, many people will just say, well, I don't work on natural language processing. I cannot make my computer understand text, so I don't work on this area. Now, the situation has changed substantially in the last 20 years, and now there are many off-the-shelf software and libraries and things that you can use to understand microtext, in this case, like social media postings, and to understand them automatically, to classify, to filter, to rephrase, to do many operations with text you can do now automatically with software, right? If you look at, suppose we look at one particular platform like Twitter and we look at what is the sort of data that you obtain from this? One of the first questions is, what are the categories of information that people tweet about? And then who are these people who actually provide information through Twitter? And the answer, as many things that have to do with the internet, is that it's a very chaotic thing, right? You have many sources speaking about many things at different types, at different times, in different ways, with different vocabulary, in different languages. Like, it's all very chaotic, and which is like the beauty of it, right? At least to me. This is in this whole chaos, there is some regularity, right? So this is a data set that is available at this website, crisislex.org. This is a study about 26 different disasters in different countries and how they are expressed in, how people express themselves in Twitter with respect to these disasters. The red part of these bars corresponds to messages of caution and advice, and it indicates the typical things are tornado warnings, wildfire warnings. Like, these are things that the alerts, right? Alerts and warnings that about a disaster, mostly saying that something happened, right? Then the yellow portion here is about individuals, right? So individuals who were affected, and social media, as other types of media, has its own biases, right? Just as newspapers tend to cover certain topics because they are spectacular or they affect elite people, elite countries, and so on. They have their own news values. Social media has its own values, right? And it tends to hook into stories of personal interest, things that happen to celebrities, things that happen in places that are well known, and so on. So they have their own biases, and we observe like a big chunk of data that is about people that refers about individuals who were affected by a disaster. And then you have infrastructure and utilities such as, okay, I don't have electricity, I don't have water, and so on. And then messages of sympathy and support, which are it's a big category of what people post in social media. If you have seen a crisis or a disaster unfold through social media, you have seen that many people post messages about thoughts and prayers and this type of distant like sympathy for things. And then there is other useful information. And just to give an idea, so the first one is an earthquake, the second one is a flood, the third one is an event involving haze, and then floods and wildfires and so on, and a helicopter crash and a fire in a disco. Like, there are many things here going on. And they all tend to mention the same topics, but in different proportions. Sometimes even the same event in two different, or a similar event in 2 different years, but in the same place, may have a completely different footprint in social media, right? So one thing that we observe if we start to look at all these events like simultaneously is that there are certain patterns, right? So, and these patterns, one of these, the most obvious patterns is who says what, right? And in this case, you have different types of actors like traditional media, people who are not in a disaster, or eyewitnesses like people who are there on the ground, governments, NGOs, and business. And you see that these people focus on different topics. So for instance, the media tends to focus a lot on affected individuals. And these individuals tend to be celebrities, right? So here this speaks to you about how useful and how not useful is social media, right? So you sometimes find a big volume of information about a disaster, not because many people were affected, but because some famous actor was tangentially affected by the disaster, right? Or from in a very distant manner, right? So again, social media has its own biases, just as the traditional media has its biases. Then people who are not in the disaster, they tend to offer their sympathy, support, prayers, and thoughts, and so on, and then sometimes some extra useful information. Then the government tend to focus on messages of caution and advice, right? On issuing warnings, alerts, advice, tips, and trying to tell people how to respond to this disaster. And interestingly, also NGOs and business tend to align themselves in these situations, right? So you have NGOs, of course, very concerned with donations and with volunteering, and also business, for-profit business, that also speaks about, behaves online like an NGO during disaster. There are many corporations that have public relations, corporate responsibility departments, and they tend to speak about donations, the donations that they made or the donations that you can make through them. And then, interestingly, when you look at so many different disasters, you start to see certain regularities in the way that things unfold. And what you see on the internet can be summarized as an accelerated disaster cycle. Right? It's like an accelerated disaster cycle in which instead of having days or weeks before the, so let's say reconstruction or it starts to take place, people on the internet go very quickly to this, and on the third day they are already speaking about how to rebuild things, right? So on the first 24 hours tend to be characterized by messages of caution and advice and by the sympathy and support of outsiders, right? So next time you witness a crisis or disaster, try to look for these patterns, and you will find most likely this caution and advice, sympathy and support on the first day. The second day tends to be more characterized in general by people trying to determine the cost of a disaster, right? So how many people were injured, how many people are missing, how many people were killed, and this is like the effect of the disaster in individuals. And then a little bit later, but also on the second day, people start talking about the infrastructure that was damaged, the utilities that they don't have access to, and so on. Like what are the material consequences of the disaster, or the consequences of the disaster over the built infrastructure. And then on the third day, people start speaking about donations, about volunteering, about useful information on how to deal with the disaster, and so on, right? So you see, it's like an accelerated cycle of disaster, like that it's a disaster being witnessed on real time. And then on the fourth day, another disaster happens somewhere else, and this is forgotten completely, and the people on the internet move on, except of course for the people who were affected. Now, one of the first concerns that people have when you start telling them about all this information that is on social media that can help them deal with a disaster, one of the first concerns is about credibility and veracity. And this is a concern that mostly comes from, I would say, less young people, right? So this is credibility and veracity has a lot to do with whether the internet was something new to you in your life, or whether the internet, the web, and social media was something that came to your life, or was something that was in your life from the beginning, right? So if it was something that came to your life, then you tend to have more distrust. If it was something that was in your life, has been in your life forever, then you have perhaps developed your own mechanism for verification and for credibility on the internet, right? And even the older crowd, I have never seen a person who looks for a recipe on how to cook something and does a web search and start cooking immediately with the first result. People don't do that. So people tend to verify information. They go online, they look for one recipe, then they contrast the different ingredients with their own background information about how you are supposed to cook this, and then probably they go to another recipe, then compare, and so on. And people develop their own information verification practices. And the same is true for social media during disaster. People have their own verification practices. People are not powerless in front of misinformation or disinformation. So here you have, in this topic, in the topic of credibility, one of the main collisions is between traditional media and social media. Sometimes this collision gets ugly. For instance, in the New York Post, after the Boston Marathon bombing, they posted a photo that circulated on Reddit that showed two guys who were wearing big backpacks, and somehow in the moment of that photo, they were not looking at the marathon. They were looking in another direction. And then Reddit identified these guys, said, okay, you match the profile, you're young, you're carrying big backpacks, you're brown enough to be suspicious, right? And they took this photo, and this was the most upvoted photo in Reddit for this thread. And what the New York Post did was to take this and said, okay, these are the suspicious guys. And what of course, these two people who had nothing to do with the bombing, they turned themselves to the police because they were fearing for their own life and their own safety. So they turned themselves over to the police, and the New York Post didn't really they published like a half apology. And they say, well, this is why social media is so risky, because they have all this false information circulating, right? Which I think is really not not properly, let's say, self-reflective, right? And this is in CBS News. There is a sideways tornado, right? This is actually called a shelf cloud, and the news was pulled a few hours after being posted, but again, the same phenomenon, right? So you see a photo on the internet, then traditional media picks this photo, then they take it off, and then they blame the internet for having this information, right? Now, speaking a bit more of the high level about this, one good framework to reason about this is this framework of elements of trust by Geffen, proposed by Geffen in 2002. There are other frameworks for speaking of trust. Some of them include more elements, some of them include less, but this is sort of a middle ground that I think has the correct ingredients. And these ingredients are competence, benevolence, and integrity. So competence is that you are posting in social media something that, in this case, competence reflects the fact that you are posting information about something you know, right? About something that is within your competence. Maybe it's because you have the background or the appropriate preparation for this, or maybe because you witness it, but somehow you know what you're talking about. Then benevolence has to do with whether you are willing to act upon this information, right? Maybe you know, maybe you have seen something, but then it takes some benevolence in this case for you to actually speak about what you have seen or post information about what you have seen. And then integrity, of course, and this points out to whether you're being honest about what you are reporting or not. And whenever one of these elements fail, you have also a failure, right? But these failures are of different nature. So if the person who is posting this information does not have the competence or the information, either the background or have witnessed what happened, then you have what's called misinformation, right? Misinformation is a mistake. It's an honest mistake. You believe that something, but it was not true. If benevolence is absent, then of course you don't see the reports. And if integrity is absent, then you have disinformation. So disinformation is lies, are lies. Disinformation is when you believe something, but you write something else, right? This is disinformation. It is intentionally spread, and it's much more common on human-induced disaster than in natural hazards. In natural hazards, it is actually difficult to find disinformation. It's actually difficult to find misinformation. So we have some studies where we have look at the characteristics of false information online, and during a natural disaster, especially in the early hours of the natural disaster, it's difficult to find something false. Even if you explore this data weeks later and you have all the information about what happened, you look at what are the messages that are being posted, the vast majority of these messages speak truth, and they speak about something true, something that happened for real, right? But there are, of course, there is disinformation, of course there is misinformation, but I would say it's much less comparatively to the amount of good information that you find there. Now, something that in these elements of trust, I think there is another collision which is not between traditional media and social media, but perhaps between formal emergency response organizations and emergency management organizations and social media. And this collision has to do with what to do with unverified information, right? What to do with unverified information. It's also a collision of governments with social media. It's not only, it's a collision of mostly with the past and the present, right? So if you think of this as an individual who is affected by a disaster and who is used to the internet, then what you really want, and this is what some people have done through also surveys, what people really want is immediate information. Even if the information is not verified, as long as the information has as long as the information communicates well what's the level of certainty, right? So if something happened, you want to know, even if the information is not yet verified, you want to know that it's not verified, right? You want to know there was a report about a train crash. Now, the government knows about a report about a train crash. It's not verified yet, but they know about this, right? Or there was a plane crash, or there was a flash flood, or there is any event that is happening. You want to know it immediately. This is your preference. Now, let's say the traditional preference will be to wait until the information is fully verified. But by the moment the information is fully verified, a lot of disinformation and misinformation have been poured already into the internet, right? So you will find if the emergency management agencies do not own this conversation, do not get on top of the event that just happened, at least communicationally and on social media, somebody else will. And these people who fill this gap tend to be either much less competent or much less benevolent or much less tend to have much less integrity than what an authority can provide. And in this case, it's a mistake to wait too long, right? This is the typical mistake, is to wait too long. You wait too long, somebody else posts misinformation, disinformation, and end up misleading the public. Ideally, you post as early as possible what you know. And this Admiralty scale, they include a scale from A to E on reliability and 1 to 5 on credibility of the source and the information, right? So the best information is A1 information, which comes from a source that is completely reliable, which are very few sources, and is content that has been independently verified by multiple sources. So this is A1 information, and this is what perhaps a traditional emergency management office will look for and will try to report. But this information is available sometimes. Other times you have to deal with B2 information, C2, B3 information, which is information that comes from sources that are not completely reliable or that has not been completely verified. And the preference, again, our preference as internet users, our preference tends to be to have unverified information as early as possible, as long as the information is labeled as unverified. Now, once you go through, once you go through these steps of classifying, verifying, annotating the information, comes the point of trying to aggregate this. And here I want to talk about this area that is not so explored, which is how to answer these big picture kind of questions, right? These are the typical big picture questions, like how many people were affected, how many injured, how many displaced, how many missing, and so on. And the resource, how many resource units need to be mobilized. These are very difficult questions. My answer to this question is that there is no answer yet. Right? This is the things that are being developed. These are, and the main reason why these things have not been developed yet is that our, let's say, methods, predictive analysis methods, tend to be based on historical information using a technique called supervised learning, right? Using supervision. So the kind of methods that statisticians and machine learning people can develop to try to answer these questions are required data. And this data is perhaps the worst possible scenario for data, because you have data that covers a very broad range and also data that is very rare. So this is this plot shows different earthquakes and hurricanes that have happened in the US, and this is the magnitude of the earthquake or the hurricane measured in dollars, right? This starts at $1 million, and here you have $1,000 million, or what Americans call 1 billion, right? So you have, of course, you have here this follows a power law with some very large events existing, with the existence of some very large events, but this doesn't have a typical scale. So there is no typical scale for an earthquake, there is no typical scale for a hurricane. So it's very difficult for me to grab like a set of, let's say, average hurricanes and then build a predictive model that tells you what is the relationship between social media, how social media can predict the magnitude of this event, because the scale is too broad, and the really, let's say, significant events are too few, right? So this is a very challenging scenario. Nevertheless, some things have been done. And they all try to adopt the perspective of the emergency manager, right? So you have this emergency manager who is looking at some authoritative sources of information, but also wants to incorporate social media information. And perhaps the most typical scenario is this, where the emergency manager is not looking directly at every data point, but it's looking, for instance, at a map, and this map is based on some inferences that are done from different sources, remote sensing, sensors, and so on, and forecasts, and it's looking already at predictions that come from a model, right? So think of this as weather predictions, right? So this will be the most typical case, and then you have on the side, maybe, in some cases, a screen showing you some information from the public, from news, from social media, from TV, and so on. For instance, this is done on, in Germany, actually, in 2015. This is one of the earliest examples of this type. This is day 1, day 2, day 3 of floods in the Elbe River. And this is the social media response to those floods, focused on Magdeburg, I think. And of course, you see here some biases, like for instance, the bias that social media information tend to be more abundant in heavily populated areas or areas of more population, right? But there is some relationship between these things. This is another case for a hurricane in the Philippines, and you have the hurricane picking up, let's say, speed as it crosses the islands. And then you have these are reports, and the red ones are heavy damages, and the orange ones are mild damage. These are photos and tweets. And you see that there is some relationship between what the places from where people report damage and the trajectory of the actual hazard. The same, this is for Italy. This is an earthquake system. And here, earthquakes are perhaps a very interesting case because in areas that are seismic areas, the density of sensors can be pretty good, right? So you can have a very good authoritative data telling you what was the magnitude of the earthquake in different places, how much was it? What is the magnitude in different places? But the consequences of the earthquake depend on factors that are much more local. Like the quality of the ground, the construction type, and so on. And this can only, let's say, the best observation possible of these consequences are reports from the public. In this case, concentrated, of course, around populated areas, but telling you about what were the real effects of this earthquake on the lives of people, right? And this can only be told by the people themselves, even if you have abundant sensors. This is a similar work for landslides and rain, again trying to combine social media information with, in this case, with meteorological information. Now, ideally, like in an ideal world, you would like to have social media being just one more data source that you can use in emergency management, and that is mixed with the remaining data source, and so that the emergency managers can just look at the integrated view. This is many years in the future. What we have now, perhaps the best things that have been done has been to have separate models and try to merge them at some point at the model level, right? For instance, this is done in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and what they have done is that they have meteorological stations around, I think around 20 stations in the city measuring rainfall, and what they have done here is to interpolate between the stations using tweets. So they know nearby the stations what is the response in Twitter to rain, so how much people tweet about rain-related topics around this station, and what they do is that they interpolate between the stations so that they can have a much more accurate map of rainfall. And this measurement of rainfall, this partial prediction, this is related to rainfall, is fed into the model that is used to predict flood risk, and uses, in a sense, uses social media predictions as if they were the data about rainfall, but at a much fine-grained granularity than what the pluviometric sensors can give them, right? So this is one of the best cases that I have seen of that, and it just happened actually this year. And another example of this is of this integration that is eventually that is happening in different ways, is to have systems such as EFAS for flood risks that can run their own hydrometeorological model to predict flood risk, and then use this to start social media-based data capture and modeling in order to try to determine the extent of a flood, right? So in this case, this is rainfall in Calabria. This happened in October, like a couple of months ago. And so here is the rainfall up to 300 millimeters here, and this is the distribution of tweets on the same day after being processed by a neural network that separates tweets that are related to floods from tweets that are not related to floods. So the tools are there to be able to filter, classify, and geocode tweets automatically. Now, one of the earliest applications of, let's say, social media to disasters was to perform crisis mapping. And perhaps I can show this video. This is a video done by people at Facebook on the response to the Nepal earthquake in 2012, if I remember correctly. So what we have here is the area in which the earthquake happened, and then the yellow are people who, the yellow dots are people who use Facebook safety check, and the blue dots here are friends of those in Nepal and India that were affected by the earthquake. And then here we also have Facebook this was one of the first instances where they allow people to donate through Facebook, to donate money. And these yellow things, they are not missiles, they are money donations sent to Nepal from Japan, from North America, from Brazil, from Europe, and so on. You have thousands of donations being made to people in this earthquake through the internet. And just as people donate this means that, to me, this means that disasters today have a response that is global. And this response, there is a big amount of energy or will, let's say, will. There is a willpower to help in these disasters. That is my former colleague Patrick Meyer speaking about maps, right? Crisis mapping has been going on for many years, and perhaps one of the earliest examples was this crisis map of Libya. And I think what's really interesting here is that this was the moment, this tweet was really significant for the crisis mapping community, because at that point, nobody really had a clear picture of what was happening in Libya, including the United Nations. And what they say, when they said here in this case, they said, well, if you want to know what happened in Libya, look at this map. And this map was done by volunteers. So the map that is behind this URL is a map that was powered by volunteers. And this was the moment in which somehow let's say the former community blessed crisis mapping as an effort that was worth doing, right? And from that moment, there have been many efforts of crisis mapping. There is a huge mailing list of crisis mappers. There are many organizations. There are many efforts about crisis mapping that don't look like crisis mapping. So for instance, this was an application for tablets that we developed that was for trying to evaluate the economic impact of a typhoon. And this economic impact in the Philippines, in this case, was measured in the number of coconut trees that were damaged, or the amount of plantations of coconut that were damaged. So we were asking people to look at these photos and to label a coconut tree as healthy or damaged, right, in order to evaluate economic impact. This was another project with a national park in Zambia, in Namibia. And the idea was, again, like people had an iPad application or a tablet application where they could label, find animals, right? The idea was to find animals. So you will have to draw what we call a shield around an animal and the animal's shadow. And with this, you can build a model for counting animals, right? And this doesn't look like a crisis mapping, but it uses similar techniques. So you have a big crowd that is willing to provide some work that a machine cannot do so well in order to train a machine to do this type of job. And this, I think I have like 15 minutes more, right? Now these people, to me, this effort has been one of the most interesting ones because people liked it. So people liked to do this type of volunteering, right? And even children like to do this type of work, which leads us to think, okay, who are these people who are willing to do some volunteering online, some digital volunteering, right? There is an entire book that I recommend about this. It's called Digital Humanitarians, again by my colleague Patrick Meyer, and they speak about who are these people, who is this community, what moves them, what they do, why you have someone in Germany helping people find their loved ones in the Philippines or Indonesia. Like, how does this happen? And the truth is that volunteering is a mixed blessing, and it's something that, first, volunteering is a constant. It's something that happens in every disaster, and you study disaster, perhaps have read about like all this literature about regular volunteering. Like the most common effort of volunteering will be to put sandbags next to a river, right, to try to protect your property from water damage, right? And now disasters involve a convergence of these people, resources, and information, right? And from traditional disasters, we know that some of the resources that arrive during a disaster are useful. Some of the people who come to help in a disaster are useful. And also, we should add that some of the information that you receive during a disaster is useful. And of course, by extension, some of it is not. Right? And this convergence is something very difficult to manage by formal response organizations. All this convergence, the convergence of resources that you don't need, the convergence of people that are really in the way, right? They are in the way, and also the convergence of information that maybe is confusing you, is not helping, right? So this volunteer is a mixed blessing and has always been a mixed blessing, continues being a mixed blessing, right? And volunteers today are both local and remote, and perhaps this is what is new from the fact that you have social media, right? That you and the internet is that you have not only these people that can help on the ground and provide, for instance, information through the internet, but also you have people who are very far away. So this is a book by Andy Carvin where he speaks about all the role that he had as an information broker during the protest during the Arab Spring. And he says, okay, I was a witness, but I've never been to the Middle East. But nevertheless, he had a very important role curating information, aggregating information, and witnessing what happened and trying to help. And there are some advantages to being far. Of course, there is a disadvantage, right? The big disadvantage is you're not there, right? You're not seeing things through your own eyes. You are seeing it through the eyes of others. But there is a big advantage is that you have the resources that you need, and you are not yourself affected by a disaster. And people who are in the disaster area, maybe they don't have electricity, maybe they have internet connection that is very flaky or is not existing at all, or maybe they have other urgent needs for themselves or for their family, and this means that they cannot really perform effectively. But people who are far away, like in a comfortable environment, in a safe environment, they can provide their work, their time in a manner that is sometimes quite effective, right? This is the remote digital volunteering. Digital volunteering also has to do with these organizational types that have been studied for many years, now more than almost 50 years, right? That happened during a disaster among the organizations that exist and the organizations that are created, and particularly how difficult it is to deal with these emergent organizations, these people who organize themselves during the disaster. And perhaps here, what to me what's interesting is that all these things that look like very special and very anomalous and very unique are actually not special, not anomalous, not unique, they are normal. Like, for instance, having emergent organizations, having people who come together to help during a disaster is normal. It happens in every large disaster. People get together with their neighborhoods or whatever, and they try to help, and the same happens online. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen because of lack of planning. It's not a criticism of formal organization. This happens normally, right? And then, again, another thing that are normal is that you have a very small active course of digital volunteers that perform like most of the work, and they are very committed. And then you have tend to be surrounded by a group of volunteers that get in and out, and they tend to be surrounded by a huge crowd that actually perhaps does only one act of digital volunteering and then disappear. Again, this is normal. This is how things happen online, and these are expected things. It doesn't mean that the group is dysfunctional because it has so many users who are less active than the other. This is how things happen. And then among this, a new, let's say, 5-year trend on this is the existence of digital volunteering groups, such as virtual operation support groups that are started, I think started in the US, but in Europe there are many examples at the national level, at the regional level of people who interface between the internet or public provided information or user-generated content and authorities or formal response agencies, right? These groups tend to be small, experienced, and are trusted, which is what allows them to be this connection between, let's say, you can say like the formal or existing organization and emergent organization. Now, I want to speak briefly about the motivations, and then I'm going to show the conclusions, right? So there have been many studies on what motivates, well, not so many, but there have been a few studies about what motivates volunteers. And these studies typically find some commonalities between what people do as digital volunteering for disasters and what software developers that develop free software do. And what perhaps other online communities do at the same time. So there are overlapping motivations here. And understanding motivations is very important, because if you do not understand motivations, you cannot attract a big crowd of volunteers to help you. And if you don't understand motivation, you will not be able to retain this crowd of volunteers that can provide you so much valuable information. And the motivations, perhaps what I gathered from previous studies on motivation is that motivations are diverse. So there is, of course, there is a clear calling to people who have altruistic, let's say, values, right? Who value helping others. Of course, this is important, but it's really not the only thing. And there are many other reasons why people do these things. They want to have a sense of community. They want to become more skilled at using a certain tool or a certain platform. They want to perhaps enhance their social reputation. There are many of these things, and they don't exclude each other. You can have someone who is very altruistic, but also sees this as a potential professional career and wants to get more involved in disaster response. And this is like a very good way of entering this domain, because you don't need formal training. You can just show up online, contribute your work, and be valued by the amount of work that you provide, and perhaps that can lead to something else, right? So there are all sorts of people who arrive here. Altruism is at the core of their motivations, but there are many other motivations, and nurturing a community requires to understand those motivations. This is very important to know why people do this, right? Now, I want to show one more example of something that to me is like what will be to me the end game, or the end game of digital volunteering, right? And to me, the end game of digital volunteering will be to have real-time digital volunteering, right? So this is an experiment done with a drone. This is based on a pre-recorded video in which we ask 50 people to click on any infrastructure that looked damaged, right? So the 50 people will click on any infrastructure that looked damaged, and here we see that people are starting to click, and then there is a computing program that really has no artificial intelligence, not computer vision, nothing. It just aggregates clicks. And this program looks at, for instance, here there is a person who clicked there, and all the other 49 volunteers understood that this road was like this before, right? And the others clearly see that there is here there is no roof. They say, well, this house probably was like that before. Here there are some damaged windows. They miss them, but they do see there, right? So they see here there is some damage. There is damage there. Of course, the drone here is unaware of the people who are clicking because it's pre-recorded. But as the drone centers around areas that show some more damage, then the volunteers click and click and click. And these 50 volunteers are able to create a very good mapping of what are the infrastructure that look damaged, right? And to me, why this is important, because these are things that change the order of magnitude of how quickly you can do things, right? So instead of taking days to go and try to do a survey of damage, perhaps you can fly a drone, ask volunteers to annotate things, and have this thing in minutes. So by the time the drone lands, you already have your map of what are the infrastructure that were damaged here, particularly in an area where perhaps it's difficult to get access to, right? So now, I believe volunteers can do much more than this. So I think volunteers through the internet, I think volunteers can do much more. They can create the categories, they can create the hypotheses, they can suggest interpretations. There is much more that they can do than merely annotating. Now, I want to suggest some research directions for this. So I think that in this space there are things that have been done over and over again. Event detection is something that is perhaps overdone here, right? It has been done many times. It's very difficult now today to publish a paper on event detection using social media. But there are things that have not been done so much, and this is where perhaps interdisciplinary collaboration is absolutely necessary. One of those things is try to infer from the response in social media what actually happened on the ground, how many people were affected by this disaster. The other thing is to try to understand conversations, right? So people, social media is not is more like a transcript of a conversation than a document intended to be consumed on its own. To do some participatory mining, to do perhaps real-time mining, to mix like computational methods with volunteering methods. So I think there are many open questions where you have a lot of elbow room to think of, okay, what could be an interesting project that one could do that incorporates some information from the public into what you are doing. Okay, I think I have still 5 minutes, but I'll wrap up here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Chato, for this valuable insights into this huge domain of social media and crisis management. I would like to open the floor for questions. Are there any questions or remarks? I think we don't have a second microphone, so I'll have to move around.
Yes, my question would be, are there any programs or apps already available that can be used in the field or for NGOs or response agencies?
Right. So I would say that yes, but there are some tools that are there are very few tools that are specific for disasters, right? And they tend to be experimental. They tend to be created by universities for some time and then they disappear. In other cases, they are alive, but they are behind a paywall and so on. I think many people what do is that they use tools that were developed for marketing, for online marketing, that they are for reputational. For instance, for monitoring the reputation of a brand. And then they take these tools and they repurpose them for their own ends, which in this case is emergency management. So I think there is a gap between the tools that are necessary for this and the tools that exist. And that gap has, to a large extent, has been filled by perhaps a few examples of this and some examples of marketing tools that are reused for this. Now, if you can, taking one step back, you can think that this whole thing is reusing a tool that was not meant to do this. So Twitter was, or Facebook, these platforms were not designed for disaster management. They were designed for people to post photos of their dogs or their cats or their weddings, right? But they have been repurposed for other things. And in that repurposing, we have what we see is that the emergency managers see these tools and see, well, the tool is not appropriate for me, right? Because I see too much data, I see all the garbage, and I don't know who to trust. And you can answer to that, well, this was never meant to be for you. Right? This was meant for doing something else. We are trying to kind of retrofit, so to feed some other purpose into this data. So the answer is, there are, but not many. There are some tools, but not many.
Okay, I'll grab the microphone. Are there any? I see there are 2 questions from the internet. I'll pass the microphone to you.
One question is from Timo Lügge. He was in Turkey last year. He asked a question about geocoding. How do you deal with the issue that only a small percentage of social media posts contain geocoded metadata? Related, how do you deal with incorrect coordinates? In Nepal, for example, a lot of GPS coordinates mistakenly showed updates as being from Kathmandu because people didn't have internet access at rural areas and only posted information once they had reached the Kathmandu area.
Right. So, hey, Timo. Hi. The information that has explicit coordinate, as Timo observed, is a minority of the information. Then there are increasingly sophisticated systems that do analyze the text, and they spot geographical references in text. Now, these systems suffer from at least a couple of ambiguities. One is that there are names of places that don't look like that look also like things that are not places. This is a geo-non-geo ambiguity. And there are words that can be used for more than one end. Like, for instance, Texas Hold'em, that's a game of cards, but it's also the name of a state, right? So Texas. So in this case, there is a geo-non-geo ambiguity. And there are also geo-geo ambiguities, like there are like at least 5 places on Earth that are called Paris. and there are 2 Barcelonas, and there are many same kinds, right? So, but the systems are getting increasingly sophisticated to be able to geocode these things. The other thing is, I think, and this is perhaps a trend that I have seen more recently, is to try to use authoritative data to disambiguate these geographical coordinates, right? Or geographical references. So in this case for IFAS, we know where is the area that we are interested on, and we know where is the area that there is rainfall and so on. So, for instance, in this case, one simple thing can be, well, we filter out anything that is not in our area of interest, right? So one can use somehow the authoritative data to guide the geocoding. But this is going to continue being a need, and it's going to continue being done with some ambiguity, and the only thing that can really save you is redundancy, right? So have so much data that even if a small part you can geocode accurately, you can still do something with it. Yeah, I hope that answered the questions.
There's another question on YouTube from Wyson Sandoval. At first, he thanks for this presentation, and he's watching from Florida. And the question is, in the case of rapid onset disasters, such as earthquakes, emergency agencies in countries like Chile and US send officials to assess damage inside immediately after. How do that info compete with media? And he write more. I mean, it exists methods and tools used by institutions to collect reliable data on damages, impacts. I understand media complement these sources, but there's a big difference.
Right. So, okay, so I think here, so here I should have pointed out that these data are not of the same quality as authoritative data, right? It's not the same quality of data. It's not done by a professional. There are ambiguities. There are more mistakes than what a professional can make, and of course the quality is lower. And what can help to deal with low quality, as many things on the internet, is redundancy. So the fact that you may have mistakes, but if you have a big amount of messages, then those mistakes are drowned by correct information, right? So that's my first thing, is that perhaps I said that this replaces the information. I don't think it replaces, because the quality is lower. Now, on the other hand, the coverage is much higher. The coverage is much larger. So you can cover a much larger geographical area. You can have experts on the ground. You can fly them as fast as you can to the place where the emergency where the emergency happened. But can you put this many people on the ground? So can you put this many people on the ground in this many different places to take photos and to see what they are to take photos and to tell you what they are seeing? That nobody can do, no matter how much resources you can. So I think these two things complement each other, and I don't see this as a replacement of the traditional measures. And again, I recognize that the quality of this information is lower than the quality that a professional can get, but the coverage is much larger, and you can have both things happening at the same time, having, as I said at the beginning, and I said in other slides. So I think the end game is to be able to combine this information in such a way that you can get the best out of both streams.
Okay, are there any other questions currently? If not, I would like to ask you another question. So you were talking about digital volunteers on the one hand side who are willing to contribute, but the huge amount is kind of involuntary Twitter data.
Right.
What types of mechanisms do you see to engage them to create more actionable information?
Right.
So because it's hard to discover, you mentioned the difficulties of discovering actionable data. So the ideal thing would be just make them create more actionable information. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Okay. So it's going to sound like a very cheesy analogy, right? But this is like wind power, right? So you have wind power. You cannot tell the wind, okay, today I want wind, tomorrow I don't want wind, right? Or I want wind during this time because I have more energy requirements, right? So this is largely something that you cannot control. So even when, in some cases, like emergency offices or authorities have asked people, okay, let's use this hashtag, let's use this format, let's use this, contribute this amount of information, this information with this detail in this format, people do whatever they want in the end. And most people, right? So these things help, So for instance, having a hashtag for the disaster helps, because it helps, people can coalesce around the hashtag, right? Having a format, it has been tried, it has not worked very well. It has not been adopted so much, right? So people do whatever they want. It's more like, okay, you're a bit, you can perhaps steer things a bit, but most of it is you can just observe, and people will do what they want, and you have your tools to try to figure out what to do with this data. I think people can be encouraged to provide better information, and that should be done. But I think you will still have a vast amount of users who are unaware of these initiatives, and they will post information in whatever format they think is necessary. Also, one more thing is that I think communities also develop their own practices. Mm-hmm. So particularly the power Twitter users or the people who have a large following, they tend to develop their own practices around disasters, and I think these things are evolving. I think even in Europe these things are evolving. So people now have a more, let's say, are more aware of what sort of information is valuable, how they may ask each other, right? Okay, that photo you posted, where did you take that photo? When did you take that photo? Or you can post a photo, a photo that you believe it's true, but it's not true. And then other user may arrive and say, no, this photo appeared 3 years ago in this newspaper. It's not new, right? So there is some sort of self-correction here happening, right? People telling each other how to post information, and also correcting a bit each other. And those things are also helpful. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? I don't see any questions. So thank you very much again, Chato, for this very nice talk.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
And with this, I would like to close this session. We meet each other next year, 10th of January, when Christian Reuter will give a talk. So happy holidays and a happy new year, and we see each other next year. Thank you.
Thanks.